You're listening to an ECGI podcast on corporate power and the politics of change with Matteo Gatti.
While writing my book, a colleague's body of work kept coming up. I can count at least 4 areas where ideas helped me navigate complex issues. When the Supreme Court set corporations free to spend in politics, associations of citizens policed by corporate democracy, they said, she showed why that picture was fantasy. Very few citizens look at their 401k and think civic participation. When everyone called the court pro-business, she showed the label was at once correct and wrong. Corporations gaining rights and shedding accountability, while inside governance, investors and boards ran the other way. The pro-business paradox. With Dorothy Lund, she mapped the system that converts every social concern into the language of shareholder value, the corporate governance machine. And with Mariana Pargendler, she has now identified who feeds that machine from outside, the nonprofits, left and right, behind both sides of ESG and the war against it, the engines of external governance. 4 ideas and 4 building blocks of the story I tell in my book about corporations that no longer just do business, but also govern. Elizabeth Pollman has spent 2 decades asking the questions this entire field depends on. What is a corporation? Where is it? Whom does it serve? And who, in the end, governs it? I am Matteo Gatti. This is Corporate Governance and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Stay with us. Welcome to Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. I'm Matteo Gatti, professor of law at Rutgers Law School, research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and the author of Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, published by Cambridge University Press. My book is about what I call corporate governing, the phenomenon by which corporations step into contested socioeconomic spaces, taking positions and making choices that once belonged to governments. Corporations could not govern if the law had not first made them rights-bearing speakers, which is why today we go to the foundations, the law that decides what corporations are, what rights they hold, and who constrains them. My guest today is Elizabeth Pollman, the Perry Goldkin Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, co-director of its Institute for Law and Economics, and a research member of ECGI. Corporate law has a habit of borrowing her titles: regulatory entrepreneurship, the corporate governance machine, the pro-business paradox, and now the engines of external governance. Elizabeth, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you so much. And I thought your book was just excellent. I'm so happy to get to talk with you today about all of these topics.
Thank you. You're so kind. So let's start where your arc starts. So early on, you wrote on corporate personhood, which is an amazing field as a young scholar to get into because, there's hundreds of years of legal doctrine there. So the Supreme Court for years has reached for metaphors: artificial entity, creature of the law, association of persons. With Margaret Blair, you proposed a derivative approach. Don't ask what a corporation is, but what a given constitutional right is for, and whether extending it to the corporation serves the people underlying the corporation. Give us the short version and tell us why the metaphors still persist.
Margaret Blair and I observed that across history, the U.S. Supreme Court has never given a corporation a right in its own right as a matter of fundamental logic. It grants rights either derivatively to protect the natural persons the corporation represents, or instrumentally to protect people generally outside the corporation, like listeners. And the debate has often asked, is the corporation a person? And those conceptions, such as artificial entity or concession or associations of persons or real entity, they've been given as potential answers. For most of the 19th century, corporations were relatively few, small, closely held, often quasi-public, like canals or banks or bridges. And treating them as associations of people, of individuals, it was a stretch in some instances, but not a big one in many. And by the early 20th century, you had giant publicly traded, professionally managed firms with thousands of shareholders that would continually shift. And that metaphor of associations of persons that the Supreme Court had often relied on stopped fitting for many corporations in the US, but the corporation kept reaching for it without ever articulating like a singular theory for how it was determining corporate rights. And corporations today, of course, span everything from a municipality to a small mom and pop company, or maybe Apple Corporation, or to a shell company with one shareholder that itself is another corporation. So associations of persons or people doesn't describe them all well as a factual or conceptual matter. And continuing to rely on that label lets the Supreme Court skip the actual question of whose rights are at stake. So what we were really observing was that the associations of persons metaphor has been used by the court. And across history, it's sometimes that fit most corporations, but now it doesn't. And so we appreciated that the question, is the corporation a person or what is a corporation, might not be a probative way to determine corporate rights at this point, whether all corporations should have all rights, for example. And the answer might vary depending on the context you're asking the question, and the corporations might vary widely. So for purposes of interpreting whether constitutional rights in the U.S. should apply to corporations, Margaret and I reframed it basically. And we said, well, don't ask what a corporation is or whether it's a person. Ask what a particular constitutional right is for and whether extending it to a particular corporation actually protects the real people connected to it and serves the purpose of that constitutional right. And it's not all or nothing. It's neither no rights or all the same rights of a human individual. It forces more attention to meaningful distinctions about why some corporations would have some rights. And it's rooted in the court's own cases, but it's a rethinking of that approach that doesn't rely only on the outdated metaphors.
So let's talk about some of these cases, and let's start with the cases that everybody knows, right? Citizens United, corporations as quote-unquote associations of citizens in a quote-unquote corporate democracy. So your response is quite devastating in its simplicity, right? The 401k line. And back in 2009, you had already flagged as the voluntariness problem. Shareholders are locked in through pension and index funds, unable to exit or restrain corporate political speech. 15 years on, has anybody vindicated the court's faith in internal checks?
So I saw when the U.S. Supreme Court ordered re-argument in Citizens United that there was potentially a big problem at hand with where the Supreme Court was going. I was worried that the Supreme Court would expand speech rights for corporations without taking into account the real factual circumstances of many corporations and corporate governance, especially U.S. public companies. And I was hoping to publish something before the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its decision. So I decided to write something for the online version of a journal, which has a quicker time to publication. And they were kind of new at the time. And Yale Law Journal had an online version with a short format. So I saw the court order re-argument in Citizens United, and I quickly wrote this short essay. And then they published it before Citizens United came down. And then unfortunately, the Supreme Court didn't do what I was hoping they would do in taking into account what I was writing about. But then the journal reissued it upon the Citizens United opinion coming down. And big picture, what I was trying to get at was that Bilotti, before Citizens United, and then unfortunately Citizens United, waved away shareholder protection by saying that dissenting shareholders could use the procedures of corporate democracy. But that ignores how people actually own stock for the most part, indirectly through mutual funds, pensions, index funds, often with no real information or voice about the political expenditures of the corporations that they're invested in. Exit might also not be a possibility, as I've pointed out. An index fund essentially holds the market, and it can't sell one company to protest that company's political speech without abandoning its strategy. And pension and index investors are generally locked in. So that was the voluntariness problem that I flagged back in 2009. Fiduciary accountability isn't designed for this kind of political expression, and many dissenting shareholders just don't have either a real vote or a real way out. Also, going back to the previous question, there's no fixed group that the corporation is speaking for. So ownership of a public company changes minute by minute. Many holders, they aren't citizens or even individuals, they're funds or other corporations. So you can't really pinpoint whose views the corporation's political spending is expressing. And to put it really precisely about Citizens United, what I think the court got wrong, besides not appreciating these factual circumstances that really matter for the logic of extending the rights, was the breadth of its ruling and its reasoning. Because Citizens United itself was a nonprofit political advocacy group. That's an identifiable set of people who were associated to speak. A derivative right for that entity is defensible. I think the error was ruling for all corporations and sweeping in exactly the public companies that aren't associations of persons in the way that the court reasoned. And then your part of the question about whether it's been vindicated, I think that was implicit. But corporate political spending has grown. It's gone underground through intermediaries and private ordering through voluntary pledges and codes of conduct are, in my view, an ineffective patchwork. I think you wrote really well about this in your book. And it presents classic agency and monitoring problems that shareholders just can't easily solve. And meanwhile, we never got the disclosures that Justice Kennedy assumed in the reasoning in Citizens United, that prompt disclosure and internet transparency would allow citizens to hold corporations accountable. And more recently, the Supreme Court in Americans for Prosperity made disclosure itself constitutionally more vulnerable. So internal checks actually got potentially weaker, not stronger, since Citizens United.
I just want to add that in the book, when I analyze what can be some of the guardrails, I also noticed that shareholders themselves might not be the only stakeholders that you want to poll on this, because, several times corporations are actually speaking because of some other stakeholders' pressures. And sometimes they respond because in a certain local area or state, there is some issue that they want to address. But anyways, I want to keep talking about the Supreme Court, because one of the topics in my book is that governments somehow have left a governance vacuum that corporations sort of stepped in to fill it. And a few years ago, you published a great article in Harvard Law Review, which deals with another part of the story. The Supreme Court itself has been expanding the space. So Americans for Prosperity, you just mentioned. You also talk about Ford Motor and Nestle. And sort of you come up with a common thread. And let me stay for a second on Nestle, because one line really jumped at me. The court dismissed the decisions made at U.S. headquarters as merely, quote, general corporate activity like decision-making, end quote. But, what we know is that decision-making is what corporations actually do. It is the very object of corporate law, if you will. So how did the court end up treating the corporation's defining characteristic as legally relevant? And what does that reveal about the court's broader conception of business?
Yeah, great question. So corporate law scholars often levy the criticism that the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't seem to understand corporations or corporate law and governance that well. And the issues that implicate corporate law and governance can be widely varying. They may not be issues specifically of corporate law and governance when it comes up, some reasoning about what corporations are, how they function, or what matters for determining something. And usually corporate law scholars don't get too deep in the weeds of these other areas of law, but they're aware that this matters for U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence. So in that Harvard Law Review piece, I had the occasion to write about a few cases because every year the Harvard Law Review does a Supreme Court issue, and they wanted to include something that had a business law perspective in it. So I was threading together cases that came up that term for the U.S. Supreme Court. And in each of the cases that I was writing about, what I observed was that the U.S. Supreme Court was reaching for kind of a thin or ill-fitting conception of the corporation to expand a corporate right or shrink corporate accountability. And the cases ranged three very different fields: First Amendment and personal jurisdiction and human rights liability. But it was a similar move or pattern. And I think that's what you can gain from kind of looking at these other areas from a business law perspective altogether, to understand what the impact is of the Supreme Court's reasoning about corporations in these other areas. And I think those cases, while they came up in that particular term, they're a sample or like a microcosm of a longer trend that's been happening. So in the case that you were quoting from is the Nestle case. And that case specifically was about the Alien Tort Statute. And there were claims brought by plaintiffs who had been enslaved as children on cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire. And they maintained that the corporate defendants in the case had aided and abetted human rights violations in their supply chains from their U.S. headquarters. There had to be a hook to the Alien Tort Statute, which is what they're bringing their claims under. And so critically, that case hinged on the court's understanding of corporations and where it located their activity for purposes of this potential liability. And although the plaintiff's injuries and the company's distribution of certain resources, like the training and the tools and the fertilizer and the cash for these like chocolate cocoa farm businesses, occurred in Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire, the plaintiffs argued that the corporations made their major operational decisions in the U.S. and they knew or should have known that the farms were using enslaved child labor and that they should have been able to be held liable for aiding and abetting child slavery under the ATS. And the reasoning of the Supreme Court in addressing those claims, the court really brushed aside as, in its words, general corporate activity like decision-making, which you point out, as common to most corporations. And it kind of put that to the side in trying to look at this ATS issue. And what I pointed out was that a cardinal precept of corporate law is that the board manages the corporation and acts through decision-making. And actually, as a matter of corporate law, we don't care where the board meets. corporate statutes like Delaware's even provide that you could have a meeting virtually or whatever. The directors may be in all different places when they're making that decision. That's not what matters. But it's a corporate decision once the board is making that. And then everything else flows down from that. And so to fixate on the tools and the cash on the ground and then to dismiss the corporate decision making, I think turns the ordinary understanding or business law understanding of corporate activity kind of on its head. And what that reveals about the court's conception of business is that it seems willing to disregard the reality often of corporations, including multinational corporations, like their decision hierarchies and their supply chains, to keep shrinking the places that a corporation could be held to account.
These type of pattern in different ways didn't stop in 2021 because this past term, maybe its culmination, Trump v. Slaughter. The court overrules Humphrey's executor, 90 years of precedent, and holds that the president may remove independent agency commissioners at will. 6-3. Roberts writing, Sotomayor dissenting from the bench. So there was a carve out for the Fed in Cook, but the FTC, which, one of the big corporate regulators, right, now sits within the president's general administrative control. So does your Supreme Court business paradox framework stretch to this? Like agency independence is sort of like the newest external constraint that fell. And if regulation now runs on a 4-year political clock, there's even more of the burden would migrate into how we regulate inside corporations?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question that I haven't considered much. So I think that stepping back first, pro-business paradox that I was identifying in that piece was that the idea of being pro-business is both at once correct and also just too simple because the court expands corporate rights and reduces corporate accountability. If you look at this from outside, it looks like it's pro-business, but inside the governance structure, many investors and boards, I pointed out, have been pushing the other way towards pressing companies to rein in their use of these rights, to mitigate externalities, to build out oversight and monitoring and compliance and various other things. And it raises the issue of who really benefits from these so-called pro-business rulings. And I think they tend to serve a more narrow set of people than like business writ large. And that may be large concentrated controllers, executives that have authority over things like political spending. And so that was the kind of framework that I was kind of building out in that piece, was trying to really understand whether that term makes sense and what actually the court is doing with its understandings of corporations in these various areas. And so I think tentatively, yes, I think that the framework stretches to Slaughter because I think agency independence is itself an external constraint or part of the external accountability structure. And it seems part of a larger pattern, even in some sense, with you raising this makes me think it's an even larger pattern of narrowing particular liabilities and reshaping the institutions that impose them. And if, to your point about the administrations changing and the politics getting involved, if the corporate regulators' priorities swing with each administration, the external constraint becomes more intermittent and less predictable, which pushes more of that accountability burden inward onto governance and private ordering. So my tentative answer, Matteo, is yes. But I hadn't thought as much about that one from the recent term, but I think that's a really interesting observation.
Well, glad we had the same intuition about it, but we'll both have to do some homework after this. All right, let's switch gears a bit. I want to talk about the machine and the making and meaning of ESG, other more recent piece of scholarship. So the Supreme Court misunderstands corporations and corporate governance seems to move the opposite way. So my book chronicles the rise of corporate activism and its abrupt retreat, a theme that from conversations that we had several times on the podcast. I've come to think you cannot explain either without the framework that you built with Dorothy Lund in the corporate governance machine. So in short, the claim is that shareholder primacy in America is not just a simple legal doctrine that if we want, we can kind of change. And so now, we think about stakeholderism, great, we're going to all do it. Because you correctly describe it as an infrastructure. There's law, sure, but there are institutions we just talked about. There's culture, and they're all sort of like interlocking and self-reinforcing each other. So we have proxy advisors, indices, rating agency, fiduciary framings, business school catechism, if you will, right? So can you describe us the machine and what does these machine capture that legal doctrine or corporate legal doctrine would miss?
Yeah. So Dorothy Lund and I wrote an article called The Corporate Governance Machine, as you noted. And we point out that for U.S. public companies, and we're focused on the U.S. in that piece, corporate governance isn't a neutral set of processes exactly. It's part of a system, law, institutions or markets, and culture. And all three gears generally work in the same direction towards shareholders. And by law, we mean Delaware, Congress, the SEC, the Department of Labor. They all tilt in some way towards shareholders generally. And we highlight that it's really not just a matter of Delaware corporate law, for example, even the law component, because you can look at Delaware's statute, and Delaware's general corporation law was in place during the managerialism era before we even had the era that turned towards shareholder primacy. So it's not driven by, for example, just Delaware law. Corporate doctrine alone isn't like the master key that many might assume of why we have a system one way. Then you have markets and institutions, proxy advisors, stock exchanges, indices, rating agencies, the big institutional investors and their associations. And each one of those in its own way generally defines good governance as promoting long-term shareholder value. And they all work in their own way towards adding to this system. And then you've got culture, which is of course kind of squishy and hard to discuss, but we try to break it down into some contributing factors or components of our cultural element or gear, like how business schools teach and how the media portrays corporate issues and politics. The shift from defined benefit to defined contribution plans turn millions of workers into kind of forced investors. So shareholder value rhetoric now has a different kind of like cross-partisan pull potentially. So each of these three things work together in a way and orient our system towards shareholders. And you ask what the corporate machine captures that in a sense doctrine misses. And part of this is that it's evolved from like a rule to a system. And a doctrine you could amend potentially by changing a case or a statute, but a system is more self-reinforcing and path-dependent rather than necessarily efficiently evolved and expensive and difficult to switch out of in many instances. It also helps explain, I think, the path of certain corporate governance developments, like board independence, for example. That one was coming to mind when you were talking. It was like, well, it started as an academic idea that law exchanges, proxy advisors adopted, and that drove independent directors from a relatively small minority of the composition of corporate boards to the vast majority of them for U.S. public companies. That's the machine, in a sense, homogenizing some kind of outcome. And it also, I think, critically helps explain why a major change away would require some kind of larger shock impacting more actors. So I think that understanding helps you embrace is thinking about more systematically what's contributing to our system and how they dynamically work together, and what that means for what we see and what we could potentially see in the future.
To bring it to what I explore in the book, one of the machine's signature moves is translation, right? Think about any big socioeconomic concerns, climate, diversity, human rights. In the machine, as I understand it, they survive only if somewhat converted into the language of shareholder value and risk. So think about the Business Roundtable statement of 2019, right? There was a lot of rhetoric there. There was very minimal governance change. And the translation is why I read the recent retreat of corporate activism, not as the machine really breaking, but as the machine working in a way, because it runs in reverse once the risk calculus flip. So the question is, I guess, is this translation a straitjacket on stakeholderism, or is it the discipline that keeps corporate governance honest?
Yeah, I think translation is an interesting word for that. But what we were talking about with the dynamic with the machine, in this system that we have, a concern like climate or diversity or human rights, it gets, in a sense, converted or translated into the language of shareholder value and risk. And reformers, once they see it, they lean on that to make the strategic move. They realize like, oh, if we want corporations to care about whatever, we need to reframe this. So we frame it around investors, not the general public. And in some sense, ESG took off precisely when it was framed as promoting shareholder value and around claims that value and values would align. And the Business Roundtable statement of 2019 dropped its language about corporations existing principally to serve shareholders for a commitment to all stakeholders. But then even that was framed as a means of generating long-term value for shareholders. And even that drew criticism from CII. And so this machine, in a sense, like it runs on shareholder interest and the risk value calculus. So it can channel, though, in both directions, which is what I think you're pointing out. And I don't know that we had specifically discussed that much in that piece, but I do in the making and meaning of ESG. And what I point out there and what I think you really see in your book is that when the value case for a pro-social activity weakens, the same gears reverse effectively. And so to your, is it a straitjacket or discipline? I tend to not put things in those types of terms. I really try to just be a researcher. I'm not often so colorful in my language, but I guess I would say it might be a bit of both in some sense, because enlightened shareholder value softens the hard edges and gives stakeholder reforms a path to adoption. But it's only a partial victory, because if you tie stakeholder welfare to long-term shareholder value, it's limiting the acceptable rationales, and it favors what could be reduced to like a risk or return metric, no matter the overall welfare gain. It limits what sorts of things can be adopted and what the logic for that is, and it limits often what it will be.
So you mentioned a second ago the making a meaning of ESG. So you were extremely helpful for everyone to talk about the genealogy of ESG. And the funny fact is that the first time I heard ESG, I thought of a New York seminal no-wave band called ESG, but ESG stands for Emerald, Sapphire, and Gold. Shout out to ESG. Amazing band. But so ESG that we know of and we study was not born in Lower Manhattan, but was born somewhere else, but close there, right? In Midtown, not in ethics, but in finance. Who can win? A 2004 UN financial sector initiative on folding these three factors, environmental, social, and governance, into valuation and risk again. So please tell us the origin of the story and what got you to write about it.
Yeah. So I didn't really want to write about ESG, but I was talking to many business executives and directors, and I sit in a lot of conferences with academic papers, of course, as an academic. And there were many, many papers and many people talking about ESG. And this was maybe, 2016 or so. I was writing a book chapter for a compliance handbook that was the chapter that was going to be about CSR. And I thought, like, this term ESG is getting used so much more. Maybe I should also be considering ESG in compliance, et cetera. So it was kind of like early days for this like broad, widespread. And I started to look for myself for like, how do I drop a footnote and cite what the definition of ESG is? And where did this term come from? Why is everybody talking about this now? And I just couldn't find anything that answered those questions. So that's often when I start working on a new academic project. Even if it wasn't what I wanted exactly to do and was write a paper about ESG, I thought I just have to actually get to the bottom of this. And once I did, I started digging and putting together this history. And in short, I think it really starts with the United Nations. And for many years, the United Nations had been somewhat oppositional towards multinational businesses. But in the 90s, Kofi Annan gave the famous Davos speech proposing the Global Compact. And he invited business to embrace core principles of human rights and labor and the environment voluntarily. And following that time, the Global Compact was based on an idea of, at the company level, voluntary adoption of these principles. I think people at the United Nations started to realize that wasn't going to be everything that they were looking for. And so in the early 2000s, Kofi Annan wrote to the CEOs of many of the world's largest financial institutions, inviting them to an initiative under the umbrella of the Global Compact, what became known as Who Cares Wins. And a bunch of them, 18 with over $6 trillion under management, major players like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank, et cetera, convened and they produced this report, Who Cares Wins report. And they called for the better inclusion of environmental, social, and corporate governance factors in investment decisions. And that was the coining of the term ESG. And the name was a deliberate strategic choice. You can look back to the original documents. You can see they consciously and they expressly said they were avoiding other certain terms like sustainability and corporate citizenship and CSR too, that had certain connotations and baggage in a sense. And they were trying to just focus on the environmental, social, and governance. And they deliberately included the G, the governance. They were writing in the years after Enron and WorldCom, and they said that sound governance was a crucial prerequisite to the means for executing on the E and the S. From there, they continued on with efforts to then diffuse the term and have more adoption of the term through the financial system and more broadly. And as I point out in the making and meaning of ESG, that ambiguity, though, about what it was, that was baked in from the beginning and it never got resolved. So no wonder years later, I was like, what is this term? What does it really mean? And when I was looking for a definition, the core questions around whether it was about value or values and what you would do about trade-offs between E, S, and G factors, it was never resolved. And that was part of what gave rise to the very mechanisms of the backlash as well, because the term got used for all sorts of different things, as I point out. It got used for the original idea of investment factors for financial analysis, but also for risk management. And then it got used as a synonym critically for CSR and sustainability and other terms. And from there, it was easy to jump off to understanding it as some kind of ideological preference. And once you do that, then there'll be a backlash. So that was the origin story, but also I think what's happened to it and why, because that was baked into the term from the start, that ambiguity and the possibility of it becoming kind of an ideological battleground.
This is a question that all lawyers normally hate to get, which is, what do you think is going to happen now? Is this term going to be retired because it's just such a politically charged term? I mean, Larry Fink said it, that they don't want to use it anymore in BlackRock because it got too charged. Do you think that we're going to see it again, or not really? This is going to have to find another term that it will probably also, that one eventually get caught into an original sin of ambiguity.
From a U.S. perspective, I think the use of ESG has gone way down, and very rapidly. And so I think even while I was working on the article, people were proposing other terms. They were first trying to save ESG in some way. Many people like add another letter, EESG, or actually it should have always been ES, or like add, we forgot about this thing. And so add this in. And so there were many efforts to try to change things, but you can read the piece and you can see there are other efforts too. Like in a footnote, I talk about the history of the term sustainability. And I also talk about the history of the term corporate social responsibility. And so there is a ebb and flow of different terms, and they're not all the same exactly. And they have different histories, but there is a pattern of efforts around certain things. This goes back in some sense to the corporate governance machine and why I work on these various projects to understand the even bigger picture. But I think that much of the activity of what some were doing under the label of ESG continues, but with different terms and different ways of talking about it. And that doesn't mean that various efforts of ESG failed, actually. We're just in a different time period with different understandings. And that term ESG was always limited in its clarity for use.
No, I agree 100%. And we with Luca and Roy, we wrote about corporate sustainability due diligence directive. And there, one of the issues is that when you bundle big ideas, then it becomes so easy from one political opponent to just shoot at the label as a whole, characterizing it as something that is anti-business. And in that regard, it was obviously the oil and gas lobbying fire that really pushed back a lot, and human rights got caught into it, right? And so, the Europeans were really probably slightly more concerned about the human rights component because it was so rooted in the German and French tradition. And then, but all of a sudden you have, U.S. business interests who want to take down the entirety of the project. And once it's bundled, it's much more difficult to defend it because you have to now defend several different items in a more simple sort of political battles.
Yeah. And even putting the politics to the side in some sense, even if you look at it from an academic research point of view, and specifically with ESG, when you have a term that doesn't have a singular definition and it gets used across time and space in different ways, like the things under E vary by geographic region and time, and the things under S and G and so on, then there will be academic researchers who try to understand, is ESG actually promoting long-term value for corporations, for example? But you'll get a whole range of studies and findings because of this core definitional issue, and people aren't exactly studying the same thing, and it's very hard to study in the first instance. And so you'll also have empirics on both sides in many of these instances. You'll have papers that suggest that, no, it does promote long-term value creation for corporations to engage in ESG practices, whatever that means. And then you'll have papers that say, no, it doesn't. And so then you have fodder also for the political and ideological debates that happen, even apart from the empirics themselves will be hard to prove or investigate, I should say. And that's a challenge. Sustainability may be slightly different, but sustainability is also a squishy term that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to people.
Absolutely. And in the book, I analyzed the DEI empirics, right? And that's a sort of like a subset of S in ESG. And even there, you're conflating different types of diversity. And so the studies, or if you read them as a whole, you can put them in two different categories. The ones that find a positive correlation, ones that find a negative correlation. But here, I want to discuss on a piece because I disclose a conflict of interest because, as you know, with Roy Shapira, I'm writing about what we call ideological shareholder litigation. So the lawsuits that are brought not mainly to recover, but to express some political goals. There's pro-diversity derivative lawsuits from progressive side, let's say, and anti-DEI and anti-DSG lawsuits from right-wing plaintiffs. It is part of what I describe elsewhere in the weaponization of business law, so neutral tools that are turned into instruments of political combat by both camps. So when your work with Mariana Pergendler came out, called The Engines of External Governance, which is forthcoming in the Georgetown Law Journal, I was very intrigued by the actor level accounts of who actually does all of this and why. So if the machine is the system, who feeds it? And you are noticing that there's somebody who feeds it from the outside, right? You look at nonprofits as some of the crucial actors, and they can be more different, right? You have Oxfam and Greenpeace, but also you have the Heritage Foundation. You have, as you saw, you have National Center for Public Policy Research. So very different planets ideologically, but you found a similar playbook. You want to tell us more about it?
Mariana Pargendler and I have been studying nonprofits that aim to shape for-profit corporate governance. And part of why this intrigued me was what you observed, which is that Dorothy Lund and I, in the corporate governance machine, wrote about a few players that are establishment players, like the Business Roundtable or Council for Institutional Investor, that may be nonprofits. But we weren't focused on them being nonprofits. We were just focusing on the establishment players as part of like institutions and markets, et cetera. And Mariana came to me and said, have you thought about nonprofits more generally and NGOs? This was years, after I had worked with Dorothy on the corporate governance machine. And I said, I've thought about those, but tell me more what you're thinking. And she's like, well, these other nonprofits. And I said, I think we didn't write about them in some sense because they're not in the machine. But then it got me really interested because of that thing where it's like, but where do all these things come from? So what, in my view, Dorothy Lund and I explain in the corporate governance machine in some ways is how once these ideas come in, whether it's like climate risk or a DEI or whatever, like what happens to them in our system and why and how does it work? But what we didn't account for is like, where do they start from in the beginning in some sense? And once Mariana and I started working, we were just genuinely just studying this. So we started like just pulling all these things that we could to understand this across time with nonprofits. And it's been such a fun project working with her because we found so many different examples. And it's definitely a meta kind of lumping paper where many of these organizations are very different from each other by when they were started, what their focus and mission is. Some of these could be faith-based investors, like just very different organizations. But what they have in common is often that they used a nonprofit form. We're not saying that the only organizations that come up with ideas or catalyze this as nonprofits, but they are an important underlooked factor in some sense. And they span all sorts of ideological perspectives, missions, and so on. But they often use these same strategic playbooks, and they do shape what corporations deal with and what corporate governance is faced with.
So what's the playbook that you observed?
So one thing is aiming to shape legislation and lobbying and legislation. Another is using litigation, as you mentioned, and what you and Roy are focused on. Another is using shareholder proposals and voting. And then a fourth kind of category that we look at is all these other sorts of things like shaming campaigns and codes of conduct, et cetera. So these 4 different levers, they're dynamic. Often nonprofits don't just rely on one. They're using more than one in these interesting ways. And then once you start to look at the bigger picture, you see why. So for example, if you can slowly work to snowball and get ideas hardened into legislation around the world, that may be a longer term goal. But in the meanwhile, if you could get disclosure laws and codes of conduct at the very least, and then shaming campaigns, and if you could use shareholder proposals to try to get disclosures, et cetera. So there's various tools to get the same sorts of things like disclosures, rules, and then you can have accountability. mechanisms being used. So the playbook is using those 4 different levers. Not all of them use all 4, but many of them use more than one. And the same playbook seems to be used by nonprofits that would be thought of as right or left leaning ideologically.
You observe this as a global phenomenon. Did you see, and this is like a comparative scholar, curiosity in me, do you see the same actor using different tools and a different stance in the different jurisdiction, or do they tend to have the same approach?
That's a great question. I think different tools or forms of the playbook are available in different jurisdictions in some sense. So, for example, in the US, we have for now, 14A8 shareholder proposal mechanism, and that's particular to the U.S. system, how it works, though there may be variations and things elsewhere. And we do engage in a broader than U.S. view in this paper, and we look at comparative corporate governance and what it means for that, and also how nonprofits may be acting to shape different dynamics in different jurisdictions, like investor protection in Japan or whatnot.
And so you mentioned 14A8, which you hinted is at risk of being chopped off. We had Jill here on the podcast a month or so ago, and with Tim Smith, and we were talking about that, and we were wondering what's going to happen after. And I think that what we concluded is similar to what you hinted in the paper, the sort of like an hydraulic effect, like even if some part of the tools available in the playbook gets clogged for whatever reason, these engines of external governance will find their own way to keep their voice flowing somehow and use different channels. Is my understanding correct?
So the first part of the paper describes all of these nonprofits. And then the second part of the paper discusses the tools of the playbook and how they work dynamically. And then the third paper looks at kind of the implications in various ways. And one of the observations we make there is about this pattern that once you see the bigger picture, you can see there would be a hydraulic aspect because these nonprofits are engines of external governance. They're a way of channeling in. They themselves are, formed by different actors for different purposes to channel voices, and they focused on corporations and corporate governance in many instances. And so by constraining one of the tools of the playbook, you're not changing the fact that those nonprofits exist and they have various interests that they're trying to get into the corporate sphere. They will have to shift that focus to other tools that they have, and that may affect them. And there may be different cost or effectiveness of the different tools in a sense, but you're not going to change that all those interests are there trying to get into the corporate sphere.
Not like us. They don't like corporate governance per se, and just engage in the field that they're using it as a tool. Okay, so I'm wondering now, is corporate law being enriched by voices that are external to it, or is it colonized by a politics that it cannot really metabolize? So now you and Mariana are very even-handed in the paper and very balanced. So, but we're almost an hour in, and so among friends, what do you think is the relationship between corporate law and politics, and how the two can interact together?
Yeah. So across many of the papers that I've worked on, solo and co-authored, I really do try to be scrupulous as being as rigorous and academic as I can be about a topic. I'm trying not to be pursuing anything myself ideologically. I'm trying to study something and make a contribution. I'm glad you observed that because I really try actually. And with word choices, sometimes you implicitly, and then you go over them and you realize like, oh, I don't mean to be saying that. Let me make it more precise and neutral if I can. But in some instances, there may be an aspect that does become normative and you do see something that you think taking that contribution and understanding what that means does turn in a sense normative. And I think we make some normative observations at the end of the engines of external governance. And part of what you point out is that nonprofits have genuinely widened the set of interests that corporate governance takes into account or deals with. And how you see that depends on the specific intervention and what you think corporate law and governance are for. And so even if a person does have a kind of ideological lens, they may say different examples differently. I think there are some concerns, though, that you can raise about nonprofits doing this because they themselves don't have that much transparency, and we may not be sure what interests they are, whose interests they are actually promoting when they do various things, and they may themselves have certain agency costs within their own structures. So those are the sorts of things that I think genuinely are concerning about having those actors putting their voices in through different tools. And I think we should think hard about what we do about that. And That's how I think about it. And I think the bigger question that you're asking is an important one. There just won't be an easy answer. And I don't think we can get out. And I don't think this is new in some sense either. Like we have new questions and the world changes and we have to address different things. We have different trend lines in actual corporate governance with like founder-led governance of some firms that are using dual stock structures, that are fighting against the corporate governance machine, et cetera. We have different things happening in the world that evolves. But these questions about corporations and society embedded in politics, those are very old and we can't get out of, you can't deny that's part of what's going on too. So we have to figure out ways to analyze them critically.
Okay, so every thread of this conversation, personhood, the paradox, the machine, the engines, is being tested right now in one industry. And you've been asking exactly this. In a recent keynote that I was lucky to be at, you put 3 questions to big tech and frontier AI labs. Who owns, who votes, and who actually decides? And then the harder one is who holds them accountable in a war of founder-led and mission-driven governance with huge geopolitical stakes attached. Take us through it. Which engines have real traction here? Courts, regulators, employees in the market, which are already running out. And, give us the short version of that amazing keynote.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I've turned to looking at who actually governs big tech. And as part of that, I've been thinking about the frontier AI labs. And depends how you think about big tech, but I'm looking towards the future as well, I guess you could say. And I've also been thinking about these questions around form of entity and purpose of these AI companies. And the older big tech companies like Apple and Microsoft are more subject to the corporate governance machine. And the more recent vintage of these companies like Meta and now SpaceX becoming public with its structure are much more founder-led governance with a very different regime. And the frontier AI labs have innovated their own structures, but they're much closer to the founder-led governance model in a sense. And more broadly, when you think about who is governing these companies, who has the voting power, and that's what I'm getting at when I'm using the term founder-led governance in a shorthand. But you can also step outside of the internal governance question about like who's making the decisions, et cetera, and thinking about who's regulating them. And how do they think about who actually matters as their external checks or governance? And in many ways, you come up at a loss for like what is really constraining, in a sense, these companies. Because yes, EU regulators can slap a multi-billion-dollar fine on a big tech company, but is that really affecting them? Is that really constraining them? It's part of their business, and it's not that they don't care at all, but it's not a huge constraint in the way that you might regularly think about kind of external regulators' governance. And so with these AI companies, I started to brainstorm like, well, what are the things that matter? And I think for the AI companies, the employees are really critical in part because of the talent wars, but also because of the informational issues about who has access to the information inside the company and then who leaks or gives information outside of the company. And they may be former employees, et cetera. And that really threatens to change the calculus of the environment for those companies. Because once that information is out about how things really happened, what they're really trying to do, et cetera, that can really matter for those companies. So it's both having access to the talent, but also keeping control over information. And employees are a key aspect of that. It's not that the employees exactly are the governors, but that's a really critical point for the companies. Another thing is this possibility of product liability and private litigation more generally. By private, I mean simply it's not government litigation necessarily, although there is that as well and the possibility of regulation. But these cases over everything from chatbot harms to copyright and product liability, et cetera, those are a potential significant threat to the business model of some of these companies. And those things still hang in the balance about what courts will do with those issues. So the regular way of thinking about this, like, oh, they have regulators and we make regulation that will regulate these companies. You can see that the time scale on these AI companies and the time scale on the regulation are not lining up. We will not come up with these frameworks fast enough for the sorts of questions that are coming so quickly and raise such big questions across many different areas of society. So then you start to think about these other things like employees and private litigation, et cetera, being more significant. But there's no easy answer on this. So that's why I'm looking into it, because I think it's such an important question. that corporate law and governance does have something to say about.
Right. So if there's no easy answer here, I'm going to ask you impossible questions, because one of the things that's, at least to me, come out of your 20-year arc of scholarship is question of accountability, right? And analyzed it since the beginning. And so if one could change one item, right, of looking at the future to make corporate power more accountable, and it can be a rule, can be adoption, can be an institution, something that we would suggest, I don't know, the newer generation of scholars of corporate law, corporate governance focus on, because it's something that might be very impactful in order to make corporate power more accountable. What do you think they should look at? You don't have to pick one. You can pick a bunch.
Yeah, I think I've been engaged in so many different questions and themes. And when I think about accountability, I guess I don't just think about it through the kind of traditional agency cost model. I think that's an important thing, agency costs and monitoring, but I don't think that's the whole picture. And at the same time, I do think some of those traditional frameworks for thinking about this point to one of the most important things, which is externalities regulation. Thoughtful, careful, not overly done. Externalities regulation for corporations. And that was why I was motivated in some sense to also work on these questions of corporate political speech and spending, is because I think that threatens our ability to use effective externalities regulation when the corporations themselves are so involved in having power over the very regulators and legislation that they have imposed on them. And so I think that's still a critical issue, actually, which is how do we get good externalities regulation for corporations, and how are corporations involved in that process? And it's not all bad. Sometimes corporations have vital information for the government to understand in producing thoughtful regulation and in figuring out how to govern. So it's a very complicated area to really understand and figure out how to calibrate in our system, especially when you have things like constitutional rights, et cetera, in the mix. So I still think, even going back to the beginning, that those are central, core, important questions. It's just now we have a really interesting set of developments with tech companies, startups and venture capital developments, private markets, and more.
Yeah. Well, Elizabeth, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed it.
I really did too. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, ECGI.
Okay, you can find Elizabeth's work linked in the show notes. My book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is published by Cambridge University Press. All other episodes in this series are available on the ECGI website and wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Thank you so much for listening.